Me and my crew of the Velvet Underworld channels would fairly love to hear how things are going on at your place, or you could share it to the comment sections so that we could connect with each other. Uh, we would love to build a community of people who love touching stories about mafia bosses. Now, let's enjoy today's stories, shall we?
For 10 years, Adrian Wolfe had survived by trusting no one, until the night he followed his maid into the darkness and discovered the one thing more dangerous than betrayal, a truth that would dismantle everything he'd built. If you want to know how a crime lord's empire fell to a child's last breath, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The mansion on Cresthaven Hill didn't sleep. It breathed with surveillance cameras, motion sensors, and armed men who moved through shadows like disciplined ghosts. Adrian Wolfe had designed it that way. Every angle covered, every weakness eliminated, every variable controlled. In his world, uncertainty meant death, and death meant losing the empire he'd carved from blood and strategy over the course of 15 brutal years. Adrian stood at his office window on the third floor, a glass of bourbon untouched in his hand, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a kingdom of lights and secrets. At 42, he'd survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 federal investigations, and countless betrayals from men he'd once called brothers. He'd learned the fundamental truth of power. Trust was a luxury reserved for fools, and compassion was a weapon turned against the weak. The October wind rattled the window panes, carrying the scent of coming rain. Adrian's reflection stared back at him, sharp features, dark hair silvering at the temples, eyes that had witnessed too much to ever soften completely. He wore his tailored suit like armor, every thread perfectly aligned, every detail calculated to project control. Behind him, the office embodied that same precision. Mahogany desk polished to a mirror shine, leather chairs positioned at exact angles, bookshelves lined with first editions he'd never read but kept because they suggested legitimacy. The gun safe hidden behind a Rothko painting. The panic room accessible through a false panel. The emergency exit that led to the garage where 3 cars sat fueled and ready. Everything in Adrian Wolfe's life had a purpose. Everything existed in its proper place. Until 3 weeks ago, when the routine fractured. Lena Hart had worked in the mansion for 8 months. She'd arrived through the placement agency Adrian's head of security used to vet domestic staff. Background check clean, references solid, demeanor appropriately invisible. She was 28, blonde hair usually pulled into a practical ponytail, with the kind of quiet competence that made her fade into the furniture. Perfect for a man who preferred his employees silent and efficient. She cleaned his rooms without disturbing his papers. She prepared meals he barely tasted. She moved through the mansion's 42 rooms like a ghost, never asking questions, never making eye contact longer than necessary, never giving him reason to notice her existence beyond the functions she performed. Until 3 weeks ago, when her pattern changed. Adrian had built his empire on pattern recognition, the ability to spot deviations before they became threats. He'd survived by understanding that changed behavior preceded betrayal, that small inconsistencies revealed larger treacheries, that the moment someone altered their routine was the moment they became dangerous. For 8 months, Lena had left the mansion at exactly 6:30 each evening. She'd walk down the long driveway, turn left at the gate, and disappear into the city. Regular, predictable, safe. Then, 3 weeks ago, she'd started leaving at 5:15. The first time, Adrian had dismissed it as an anomaly. The second time, he'd noted it. By the 5th consecutive early departure, his instincts had sharpened to attention. By the 10th, he'd begun considering possibilities. An affair with one of his men, dangerous but manageable. Information gathering for arrival, catastrophic, requiring immediate elimination. A second job that might compromise her discretion, problematic, necessitating replacement. He'd instructed Marcus, his head of security, to run deeper background checks. Everything returned clean. No suspicious financial activity, no unusual contacts, no red flags that suggested infiltration or betrayal. But the pattern remained broken, and broken patterns demanded explanation. Tonight, standing at his window as darkness settled over the city, Adrian watched Lena emerge from the mansion's service entrance. She wore the same worn gray coat she always did, carried the same canvas bag, walked with the same hurried efficiency. But instead of turning left at the gate as she had for 8 months, she turned right, toward the industrial district where even Adrian's influence thinned. He set down the bourbon glass with deliberate precision. In 15 years, Adrian Wolfe had never followed anyone personally. He had dozens of men for surveillance, for investigation, for the dirty work of gathering intelligence. But those same men had found nothing, which meant either Lena Hart was exceptionally skilled at deception, or the truth lay somewhere his usual methods couldn't reach. Either way, he needed to know. He pulled on a black overcoat, left the office without explanation, and descended the back stairs to the garage where his most anonymous vehicle waited. A dark sedan with tinted windows and plates that rotated through legitimate registrations every 72 hours. The rain began as he pulled onto the road, fat droplets that exploded against the windshield and blurred the taillights ahead. Lena walked quickly. Her coat collar turned up against the weather, her canvas bag clutched tight against her side. She didn't look back, didn't pause, didn't exhibit any awareness of being followed. Adrian maintained careful distance, letting 2 cars buffer between them when traffic allowed, pulling closer when she turned onto side streets where cover thinned. His hands remained steady on the wheel, his breathing controlled, but something unfamiliar coiled in his chest, not quite anxiety, not quite curiosity, but a sensation he couldn't immediately categorize. They moved deeper into the city's forgotten quarters, where gentrification hadn't reached and probably never would. Streetlights flickered or died completely. Buildings sagged with decades of neglect. The few people visible hurried with heads down, unwilling to witness whatever darkness unfolded in these streets. This was territory Adrian knew intimately, not because he operated here directly, but because he'd risen from places like this. Before the mansion, before the empire, before the tailored suits and the illusion of legitimacy, he'd survived in neighborhoods where poverty and desperation created their own brutal economies. He'd thought he'd left all that behind. Watching Lena navigate these streets with practiced familiarity suggested otherwise. She turned down an alley so narrow his car couldn't follow. Adrian parked at the mouth of the passage, killed the engine, and stepped into the rain. Water soaked through his coat immediately, plastered his hair to his skull, ran cold down his collar. He ignored it, following the sound of Lena's footsteps echoing off brick walls slick with grime and mold. The alley opened onto a street lined with condemned buildings, structures the city had marked for demolition but lacked the budget to actually destroy. Plywood covered most windows. Doors hung crooked on broken hinges. Graffiti layered walls like archaeological records of gang territories that had risen and fallen over years. Lena approached one building that looked marginally more intact than its neighbors. She glanced around once, quick, nervous, the gesture of someone accustomed to hiding, then slipped through a door that had been forced open so many times the lock no longer mattered. Adrian waited 30 seconds, then followed. Inside, the building's decay became visceral. The lobby floor had partially collapsed, revealing basement darkness below. Water damage bloomed across walls in abstract patterns of destruction. The smell hit him immediately: mold, rot, human waste, and beneath it all, the particular scent of desperation that no amount of money could completely erase from memory. He moved silently toward the stairwell, every sense heightened, one hand near the weapon he carried in a shoulder holster beneath his coat. Years of survival in hostile territory had trained him to move without sound, to navigate dangerous spaces without attracting attention, to become invisible when invisibility meant survival. The stairs creaked despite his care. He climbed slowly, listening for movement above, for voices, for any indication of what waited in the darkness. On the 3rd floor, light leaked from beneath a door at the end of the hallway. Not electric light. Too warm, too unsteady. Candles, maybe, or an oil lamp. The kind of illumination people used when utilities had been cut off or never existed in the first place. Adrian approached with the same caution he'd learned in hostile negotiations, in situations where one wrong step meant violence. He pressed himself against the wall beside the door, listening. "I'm sorry, baby. I know it's not much, but I got you some chicken tonight. Real chicken, from the mansion kitchen. It's still warm." Lena's voice, soft and aching with emotion, Adrian had never heard from her. "Mama, it hurts to breathe." A child, young, maybe 6 or 7. The words came with a wet, laboring quality that Adrian recognized from men who'd taken bullets to the lungs, the sound of airways struggling against fluid or constriction. "I know, sweetheart, I know. Just eat a little bit, okay?" You need your strength. Through the crack where the door didn't quite meet the frame, Adrian could see partial movements. Lena kneeling, the flicker of candlelight, shadows shifting against walls that had probably once been white but now showed water stains and structural cracks. He should have left, should have returned to his car, driven back to the mansion, replaced Lena with someone whose personal complications didn't create potential security risks. Should have maintained the distance that had kept him alive for 15 years. Instead, he eased the door open another inch. The room devastated him with its emptiness. No furniture except a thin mattress on the floor covered with blankets that had seen better decades. No heat source despite October's creeping cold. No toys, no books, no evidence of childhood beyond the small boy who sat wrapped in those blankets. His face pale except for the fevered flush on his cheeks, his breathing audible even from the doorway. Lena knelt beside him, carefully portioning out food from plastic containers Adrian recognized from his own kitchen. The remnants of meals he'd barely touched, the excess that would have been thrown away. She fed her son with patient tenderness, wiping his mouth after each small bite, encouraging him with soft words and softer touches. "Did you have a good day, Evan?" The boy managed a small nod. "Mrs. Chen from downstairs brought me soup earlier, and I drew you another picture." He gestured weakly toward papers scattered near the mattress, crude crayon drawings that showed stick figures holding hands beneath oversized suns. "That's beautiful, baby. We'll hang it up right here, okay?" Lena's voice cracked slightly. She took a shaky breath, composing herself before the boy could notice. "Did you take your medicine?" "The bottle's empty, Mama." The words fell like stones into still water. Lena's hands trembled slightly before she steadied them, maintaining the smile that cost her everything. "That's okay. I'll get more tomorrow, I promise." "You always promise." No accusation in the child's voice, just simple faith that his mother's promises meant something, that tomorrow would somehow be different than today. Adrian knew that kind of faith. He'd had it once, lifetimes ago, before he'd learned that promises meant nothing, that survival required abandoning belief in anyone's word but your own. Lena helped Evan drink water from a chipped mug, then settled him back against the pillows. She pulled the blankets up to his chin, tucked them around his small frame with the kind of care that spoke to ritual, a mother's attempt to create comfort where none existed. "Close your eyes, sweetheart. I'll stay until you fall asleep." "Will you sing the song?" "Of course." Her voice, quiet and untrained but carrying genuine tenderness, filled the cold room with a melody Adrian didn't recognize. Something about stars and safety, about tomorrow bringing better things, about love being stronger than darkness. Lies, all of it. Beautiful, necessary lies that mothers told children to make unbearable situations temporarily bearable. Evan's breathing gradually steadied into sleep's rhythm, though that concerning wetness remained. Lena continued singing even after his eyes closed, her hand stroking his hair with infinite gentleness, her tears finally falling now that her son couldn't see them. Adrian watched from the shadows as this woman he'd considered invisible revealed herself to be extraordinarily visible, not in the ways he'd feared, not through betrayal or deception, but through a dedication so complete it erased her own existence. 8 months of watching her move through his mansion like furniture. 8 months of barely acknowledging her presence. 8 months of assuming she returned each night to some normal life, some modest but adequate apartment, some version of stability that made her employment simply a job. Instead, she returned to this. To a condemned building with no heat, no electricity, no safety. To a child fighting for breath without proper medicine. To a life of such desperate scarcity that leftovers from Adrian's excessive table represented abundance. Lena finally stood, her knees cracking from kneeling on the hard floor. She moved to the corner of the room where Adrian could no longer see her clearly, but he heard the sounds, muffled sobs, the kind of crying people did when they'd mastered silence through necessity, when breaking down loudly meant disturbing the only person who mattered more than their own pain. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the darkness, to her sleeping son, to whatever higher power she still believed might be listening. "I'm so sorry I can't give you more. I'm trying so hard. I'm working every shift I can get. I'm saving every penny. But the medicine costs so much, and the hospital bills keep coming, and I don't know what else to do." Her voice fractured completely. "You deserve a real home. You deserve toys and warmth, and a mother who can afford to keep you healthy. You deserve everything I can't give you, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Adrian Wolfe had witnessed executions. He'd ordered deaths and watched them carried out with clinical precision. He'd seen men beg for mercy they didn't deserve. He'd navigated violence so brutal it had carved empathy from his heart like surgeons removing diseased tissue. But standing in that doorway, watching a woman apologize to the darkness for failing to perform miracles, he felt something he'd thought dead inside him stir with uncomfortable life. Shame, not guilt. He'd long since made peace with the choices that built his empire. Not regret. He'd do it all again if survival required it. But shame, that particular burning recognition that his excess existed in direct proximity to this absolute deprivation, that his untouched guest bedrooms and climate-controlled luxury represented resources that could transform this child's survival from desperate to secure. He'd built fortresses while others suffocated in condemned buildings. He'd thrown away enough food to feed this boy for months. He'd spent more on a single tailored suit than Lena probably earned in half a year of scrubbing his floors and pretending not to exist. The wealth that represented his success suddenly felt obscene. Lena eventually quieted, wiping her face with the same practiced efficiency she brought to cleaning his mansion. She checked on Evan one more time, adjusted his blankets, pressed a kiss to his fevered forehead with infinite tenderness, then moved toward the door. Adrian retreated down the hallway, descending the stairs with the same silence that had brought him up. He exited the building and returned to his car just as the rain intensified, drumming against the roof with percussion that matched his hammering heartbeat. He sat in darkness, hands on the steering wheel, breathing controlled but thoughts spiraling in unfamiliar directions. In 15 years, Adrian Wolfe had made decisions based on calculated advantage. Every choice served the empire's growth or his own survival. He'd eliminated threats without hesitation. He'd exploited weaknesses without mercy. He'd built power on the understanding that caring about others created vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities created corpses. But that logic suddenly felt insufficient. Lena emerged from the building 10 minutes later, pulling her coat tight against the rain, hurrying toward the bus stop with the same determination that characterized everything she did. She didn't see Adrian watching from the sedan's tinted darkness, didn't know her secret had been witnessed, didn't understand that the careful invisibility she'd maintained had finally, irrevocably, shattered. Adrian started the engine but didn't follow her this time. He sat watching the condemned building, the flickering candlelight visible in that third-floor window, the physical manifestation of desperation existing just miles from his own excess. His phone buzzed with messages from Marcus, routine updates about shipments and territories, and the 10,000 details that kept an empire functioning. Adrian ignored them all, his attention fixed on that distant window, on the child struggling to breathe behind walls that should have been demolished years ago. He'd survived 15 years by trusting no one, by maintaining absolute control, by understanding that power required isolation and that compassion meant weakness. But what Lena didn't know, what no one in his organization understood, was that Adrian Wolfe had once been that child. Different circumstances, different city, but the same desperate poverty, the same parent working impossible hours for insufficient money, the same understanding that survival was never guaranteed and comfort was a fantasy reserved for others. He'd clawed his way out of that darkness through ruthlessness and strategy and a willingness to do whatever survival required. He'd vowed never to return to powerlessness, never to experience that particular helplessness again. And he hadn't. He'd built an empire that guaranteed his own security, his own comfort, his own absolute control. But watching Lena return to that condemned building night after night while working in his mansion of excess suggested that escape was an illusion, that the poverty he'd fled still existed, still suffocated children who couldn't defend themselves, still broke mothers who worked themselves to exhaustion and still couldn't afford basic medicine. His phone buzzed again. Marcus, increasingly concerned by Adrian's unusual silence. Adrian finally responded with a single message. "Clear my morning schedule, something's come up." He started driving, not back to the mansion, but deeper into the city, toward neighborhoods where his influence reached through intermediaries and shell corporations, toward clinics that existed in legal gray areas staffed by doctors who'd lost licenses but not skills, who treated patients who couldn't afford legitimate hospitals and didn't ask questions about the cash that funded their operations. He made 3 calls before finding someone who answered. Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatric pulmonologist who'd been quietly working out of an underground clinic for 6 years after a malpractice suit destroyed her career despite her actual innocence. I need information about childhood respiratory conditions, Adrian said without preamble. Specifically, what would cause a 7-year-old to have labored breathing with fluid sounds? That's a wide range of possibilities, Dr. Chen replied, her voice cautious. Asthma, pneumonia, bronchitis, even more serious conditions like cystic fibrosis or congenital heart defects. Without examining the patient, what would inadequate treatment look like? A pause. Mr. Wolf, is there a child in immediate danger? He watched rain streak the windshield, distorting city lights into abstract patterns. There's a child who needs help. Tomorrow morning. Can you make that happen? I'll need details. Medical history, current symptoms, any medications being taken. You'll have everything you need. Just be ready. He ended the call before she could ask more questions, before he had to explain why Adrian Wolf suddenly cared about a sick child in a condemned building. The truth was, he didn't entirely understand it himself. Maybe it was the recognition of his former self in Evan's fevered breathing. Maybe it was the shame of watching his own excess exist in such close proximity to absolute deprivation. Maybe it was simply that Lena's invisible dedication had finally become impossible to ignore. Or maybe, after 15 years of building walls against compassion, something essential had finally broken through. Adrian drove back to the mansion as dawn started lightening the eastern sky. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and glistening, full of the false promise that new days brought new possibilities. He'd spent his life understanding that promises meant nothing, that hope was a luxury reserved for those who couldn't face reality, that survival required abandoning faith in anything beyond personal power. But watching Lena climb those stairs to that condemned room, watching her feed her son leftovers and apologize for not performing miracles, watching her sing lies about safety to a child who deserved far better, something in that absolute dedication had fractured Adrian's careful isolation. Tomorrow morning, he would confront her. Not with punishment, but with truth. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. The question that kept him awake as false dawn became genuine sunrise wasn't whether he could afford to help. His wealth made that question absurd. The question was whether Adrian Wolf could afford not to, whether he could return to comfortable ignorance now that he'd witnessed the truth, whether he could continue existing in excessive isolation while knowing exactly what that isolation cost. He stood at his office window as the city woke beneath him, watching delivery trucks and early commuters, all those people moving through their routines, unaware that his own routine had irrevocably shattered. Somewhere in that sprawling city, Lena Hart was probably riding a bus back toward the mansion, ready to resume her invisible service, to clean his rooms and prepare his meals, and pretend her own life didn't exist. Somewhere in that condemned building, a child named Evan struggled to breathe, believing his mother's promises about tomorrow. And here, in this fortress of wealth and control, Adrian Wolf discovered that power meant nothing if it existed only to protect itself. The empire he'd built could destroy enemies, eliminate threats, expand territories, accumulate wealth beyond spending. But could it save one sick child? Tomorrow, he'd find out. Tomorrow, the carefully maintained distance between Adrian Wolf's excess and Lena Hart's desperation would finally collapse. Tomorrow, everything changed. He just didn't yet understand how completely. The mansion's kitchen staff arrived at 5:30, as they did every morning, to prepare breakfast Adrian rarely ate. He heard them moving through the lower floors, the clatter of pots, the murmur of Spanish conversations, the particular rhythm of a household waking to serve needs that never changed. Except everything had changed. Adrian hadn't slept. He'd showered, dressed in a fresh suit, and returned to his office where he'd spent the remaining hours before dawn making calls and arrangements that had nothing to do with shipments or territories or the usual machinery of his empire. At 6:15, he heard the service entrance open. Lena's footsteps, familiar now in ways they hadn't been 24 hours ago, moved through the hallway toward the kitchen. She'd be hanging her worn gray coat on the hook near the staff room, tying on the apron she kept in her locker, preparing to resume the invisible service that had characterized 8 months of employment. Adrian descended the main staircase with deliberate calm, though his pulse beat faster than circumstances warranted. He'd negotiated with cartel leaders and federal agents without his heartbeat elevating. But confronting one blonde maid about secrets he'd discovered through surveillance felt strangely more precarious than any boardroom manipulation or territorial dispute. He found her in the kitchen, already moving through morning routines with practiced efficiency. She startled slightly when she saw him. He rarely appeared in domestic spaces, preferring to maintain separation between his world and the staff who serviced it. "Mr. Wolf?" Her voice carried appropriate deference, her eyes dropping to avoid direct contact. "I didn't expect you up this early. Would you like breakfast prepared?" "We need to talk, Lena." The color drained from her face so completely, Adrian thought she might collapse. Her hands gripped the counter behind her, knuckles white with sudden tension. "If this is about yesterday, I know I left early without permission. It won't happen again. I'll make up the time, I promise. It's not about the time." Adrian moved closer, watching her struggle to maintain composure. "It's about where you go when you leave here. About the building on Archer Street. About your son." The word hit her like physical impact. She swayed slightly, catching herself against the counter, her breathing suddenly shallow and rapid. I don't know what you mean." "Don't insult us both with lies." Adrian kept his voice level, though not unkind. "I followed you last night. I saw the room. I saw Evan. I heard you apologizing to him for not having more." Lena's face crumpled. Tears spilled over without sound, the practiced silence of someone accustomed to crying where others couldn't hear. She pressed one hand over her mouth, fighting for control that kept slipping away. "Please," she finally managed, "please don't fire me. I know I should have disclosed that I had a son, but I was afraid you wouldn't hire me if you knew, and I needed this job so desperately. The pay is better than anywhere else I applied, and the leftovers—" Her voice broke completely. "The leftovers feed him when I can't afford groceries. Please, Mr. Wolf, I'll work harder. I'll take any schedule you want. Just please don't take this away from us." Adrian had expected fear. He'd seen it countless times, people begging for mercy, for second chances. For clemency they didn't deserve. But watching Lena plead not for her own safety, but for her ability to feed her child with his discarded excess, created that same uncomfortable shame he'd felt in the darkness outside her room. "I'm not firing you, Lena." She looked up, confusion replacing fear, tears still streaming down her face. "You're not?" "No." Adrian pulled out a chair from the kitchen table, gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable accepting such informality with her employer, but eventually lowered herself onto the edge of the seat. "I'm going to ask you questions, and I need honest answers. Can you do that?" She nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "How old is Evan?" 7. He'll be 8 in December. "What's wrong with him? Medically, I mean." Lena took a shaky breath. "Severe asthma complicated by chronic bronchitis. He's had it since he was 3. The doctors say he might grow out of it, or he might develop it into something worse. They can't predict which." "What treatment is he receiving?" "Inhalers, when we can afford them. Nebulizer treatments, when I can scrape together money for the medication. The free clinic gives us what they can, but they're overwhelmed and understaffed." She twisted her hands together. "I try to keep him away from triggers, smoke, dust, cold air, but in that building, everything is a trigger." "Why are you living there?" Shame colored her features. "Because it's what I can afford. Or rather, it's what I don't have to afford. The building's condemned, so there's no rent, no utilities to pay. It's illegal and dangerous and completely inadequate, but it means more money for Evan's medicine, for food, for the constant medical bills that never stop coming." Adrian processed this information with the same analytical precision he brought to business negotiations. "You're working here full-time. That should provide enough for basic housing." "You'd think so." Bitterness crept into her voice despite her obvious effort to remain neutral. "But Evan's last hospitalization cost $43,000. Insurance covered some, but not nearly enough. The payment plans eat most of my salary. I'm working 3 jobs, here during the day, data entry at night from the building's common room when I can steal Wi-Fi, and weekend shifts at a diner when Mrs. Chen can watch Evan." 3 jobs. 3 jobs, and it's still not enough. Her voice cracked again. "I'm trying so hard, Mr. Wolf. I'm doing everything I can think of. But the medicine costs more than I earn, and he keeps getting sicker, and I don't know what else to do." I've applied for assistance programs. I've looked into charity care. I've begged hospitals for financial help. Nothing is enough. Nothing is ever enough. The desperation in her voice matched what Adrian had heard through that door, the sound of someone drowning despite swimming with everything they had. The father? Gone. The word came out flat, emotionless. He left when Evan was diagnosed, said he didn't sign up for a sick kid in medical debt. I haven't heard from him in 4 years. Other family? My parents died in a car accident when I was 19. No siblings. Evan's father's family pretends we don't exist. She met Adrian's eyes directly for the first time, and he saw not just fear or desperation, but a fierce protective determination. It's just us. It's always been just us. And I will do whatever it takes to keep him alive, even if that means living in condemned buildings and stealing Wi-Fi and feeding him leftovers. Whatever it takes. Adrian recognized that determination. He'd worn it himself years ago, when survival had required crossing lines he'd never imagined crossing. The medicine he needs. The bottle that's empty. What is it? Albuterol sulfate for the nebulizer. The prescription costs $217 to refill. I get paid Friday. I'm trying to make it last until then. $217. Adrian had spent more than that on the bottle of bourbon currently sitting untouched in his office. The disparity between his casual excess and her calculated desperation created a cognitive dissonance he couldn't quite reconcile. He stood, pulling his phone from his pocket. Lena watched with wide, fearful eyes as he made a call. Dr. Chen, Adrian Wolf. I need you at my residence in 1 hour. Bring everything necessary to perform a complete pediatric respiratory evaluation. Yes, the child I mentioned. No, he'll be here. Make it happen. He ended the call and turned back to Lena, who'd gone pale again. Mr. Wolf, I don't understand. You're going to go to that building right now. You're going to bring Evan here. Dr. Chen will examine him and will determine exactly what treatment he needs. I can't afford... I'm not asking you to pay. Adrian's voice carried the same authority he used in boardroom negotiations, brooking no argument. Consider it a benefit of employment. Your son will receive proper medical care, and we'll address the housing situation. Lena stared at him as though he'd started speaking another language. Why would you do this? It was a fair question. Adrian had spent 15 years building walls against exactly this kind of involvement, against caring about employees beyond their utility, against allowing anyone's personal struggles to penetrate his carefully maintained isolation. Because I can, he said finally, and because what I witnessed last night was unacceptable. I don't need charity. It's not charity. It's pragmatism. The lie came easily, familiar territory after years of justifying decisions through calculated advantage rather than emotion. You're a competent employee. Your performance would improve without the stress of your son's illness. This serves my interests as much as yours. He could see her struggling with pride, with fear of obligation, with the dangerous temptation of accepting help when you'd trained yourself to expect nothing from anyone. I can't accept this, she whispered. It's too much. You don't owe me anything. No, I don't. Adrian moved toward the door, then paused. But Evan is 7 years old and struggling to breathe in a condemned building. So the question isn't what I owe you, Lena. The question is what kind of man I am if I have the resources to change that situation and choose not to. Now go get your son. You have 45 minutes. He left before she could argue further, climbing back to his office where he could maintain the emotional distance this situation threatened to collapse. Through the window, he watched Lena emerge from the service entrance minutes later, moving with purpose toward the street, her worn gray coat pulled tight against the morning chill. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he had concerns but wouldn't voice them without invitation. Sir, the shipment from... Postpone it. The meeting with Castellano's people. Reschedule. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. With respect, these aren't minor commitments. Castellano doesn't appreciate delays. Then Castellano can develop some appreciation. Adrian turned from the window, meeting his head of security's gaze directly. Or he can find another distributor. I'm unavailable this morning. Make it work. May I ask what's more important than maintaining our existing partnerships? Adrian considered the question. In 15 years, nothing had been more important than the Empire's maintenance and growth. Every decision had served that singular purpose. Personal considerations had always taken secondary priority. A child needs medical attention, he said finally. Here, this morning, I need you to prepare the East Guest Suite for extended occupancy. Clean linens, whatever supplies a 7-year-old would need. Also, contact our usual medical equipment suppliers. I'll have a list shortly. Marcus's expression suggested he thought Adrian had lost his mind. Sir, this is highly irregular. Bringing unknown civilians into the residence creates security concerns. If this is about the Heart woman, it is. Her background check was clean, but that doesn't mean… Marcus. Adrian's voice dropped to the tone he used when patients had been exhausted. I'm not asking for your opinion on the decision. I'm telling you what needs to happen. Can you handle that? Or do I need to make other arrangements? The threat hung implicit, that loyalty meant following orders without questioning the logic behind them, and hesitation suggested Marcus's position might be less secure than he'd assumed. I'll prepare the suite, Marcus said finally, his tone suggesting this conversation wasn't finished but merely postponed. Should I inform the household staff? Only what they need to know. A guest will be staying temporarily. Medical personnel will be arriving. They're to be given full cooperation. Marcus nodded and withdrew, leaving Adrian alone with thoughts that refused to organize into comfortable patterns. He'd made this decision impulsively, driven by shame and recognition and something he couldn't quite name. But impulse was dangerous in his world. Impulse got people killed. Impulse created vulnerabilities that enemies exploited. Yet watching Lena disappear around the corner, heading toward that condemned building to retrieve her sick son, Adrian couldn't categorize this as a mistake. Reckless, perhaps. Unprecedented, certainly, but not a mistake. Doctor. Chen arrived 53 minutes later, carrying 2 large medical bags and wearing the perpetually exhausted expression of someone who'd been practicing underground medicine for too long. Adrian met her in the foyer, noting the wariness in her eyes, the appropriate caution of someone who'd learned that Adrian Wolf's requests usually came with complications. The examination room I asked you to prepare? She asked without preamble. This way. He led her to the East Guest Suite that Marcus had transformed with remarkable efficiency. Medical equipment Adrian didn't recognize filled one corner. Fresh linens covered a bed that probably cost more than Lena earned in 6 months. The room's windows overlooked gardens that wouldn't see use until spring. Dr. Chen surveyed the space with professional assessment, then turned to Adrian. Before we begin, I need to understand parameters. What exactly am I walking into? A 7-year-old boy with severe asthma and chronic bronchitis, inadequate treatment due to financial constraints, mother working multiple jobs to cover medical debt, living conditions that exacerbate his condition. And your involvement? The mother works for me. I'm providing resources to address the situation. Doctor. Chen's expression suggested she found this explanation incomplete, but she'd worked with Adrian long enough to know when to press for details and when to accept limitations. If the child requires hospitalization, then we'll arrange it, through legitimate channels or otherwise, depending on the mother's preference. Mr. Wolf, I need to be clear about something. She set down her medical bags with deliberate care. I lost my license because I prioritize patient care over institutional protocols. I'm not going to compromise this child's health to maintain anyone's privacy or avoid legal complications. If he needs emergency intervention, I'm calling an ambulance regardless of your preferences. Understood. I'm not asking you to provide inadequate care. I'm asking you to provide the best care possible without the financial barriers that have been preventing it. She studied him for a long moment, clearly trying to reconcile this request with what she knew of his usual operations. Finally, she nodded. All right. When is the patient arriving? Soon. The word had barely left Adrian's mouth when he heard voices in the lower hallway, Marcus's low rumble and Lena's higher, anxious tones. Then footsteps on the stairs, slower than normal, punctuated by a wet cough that carried clearly through the mansion's acoustics. Adrian moved to the door as Lena appeared, carrying a small boy wrapped in blankets despite the mansion's carefully controlled temperature. Evan's face showed fever's flush against unnatural pallor, his breathing audibly labored even from across the room. It's okay, baby, Lena murmured, holding him close. These nice people are going to help you feel better. I promise. More promises. More beautiful lies that mothers told children to make terrifying situations manageable. Doctor. Chen stepped forward with practiced calm. Hello, Evan. My name is Dr. Chen. Can you tell me how you're feeling today? The boy's eyes, dark and fever bright, found the doctor, then moved to Adrian with understandable wariness. Strange house, strange people, his mother's tension probably communicating itself despite her attempts at reassurance. Tired, Evan whispered, and it's hard to breathe. I'm going to examine you and see if we can make breathing easier. Would that be okay? Evan looked to his mother, who nodded encouragement despite the tears threatening to spill again. It's okay, sweetheart. Dr. Chen is going to help. Adrian watched as Lena settled her son on the bed, as Dr. Chen began a gentle but thorough examination, as the reality of Evan's condition became visible in ways candlelight had obscured. The child was too thin, his breathing requiring visible effort, his cough productive in ways that suggested significant lung involvement. How long has he been running this fever? Dr. Chen asked, thermometer confirming what touch had already indicated. 3 days, Lena admitted. Maybe 4. I've been managing it with over-the-counter medication when I can afford it. Dr. Chen's expression tightened, but she maintained professional composure. And the cough? Any change in color or consistency of mucus? It's been getting worse, more frequent, yellow-green sometimes. Has he been eating normally? He tries, but he doesn't have much appetite. The examination continued with quiet efficiency, listening to Evan's lungs, checking his oxygen saturation, evaluating his overall condition with the kind of focused attention that came from years of pediatric practice. Adrian remained near the door, simultaneously feeling intrusive in this medical moment and unable to look away. Finally, Doctor, Chen straightened, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes troubled. Lena, could we speak privately for a moment? No. Lena's hand tightened on Evan's. Whatever you need to say, you can say it here. I don't keep secrets from my son, and he's old enough to understand what's happening to his own body. Dr. Chen glanced at Adrian, who nodded agreement. She turned back to Lena with careful deliberation. Evan has developed pneumonia on top of his existing respiratory issues. His oxygen saturation is lower than I'd like, and his lungs show significant inflammation. He needs aggressive treatment immediately. Antibiotics, steroids, possibly supplemental oxygen. Under normal circumstances, I'd recommend hospitalization. I can't afford... I'm not finished. Dr. Chen's voice remained gentle but firm. I can treat him here if you prefer to avoid hospital costs. But this is serious, Lena. If we don't address this aggressively, it could progress to respiratory failure. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Lena's face had gone white again, but she nodded. I understand. Mama? Evan's small voice cut through the tension. Am I going to die? The question, delivered with heartbreaking directness, hung in the air like smoke. Lena made a sound that wasn't quite a sob, pulling her son close with fierce protectiveness. No, baby, no. You're going to get better. Dr. Chen is going to help you get better. But you said that last time, and I didn't get better. I just got different sick. Adrian watched Lena struggle for words, watched her try to maintain the facade of certainty that motherhood seemed to require, even when certainty didn't exist. He'd witnessed negotiations where billions of dollars hung in the balance, where men's lives ended based on his decisions, where the wrong word could trigger violence or federal attention. But watching this mother try to promise her dying son that everything would be fine felt infinitely more precarious than any boardroom manipulation. Dr. Chen knelt beside the bed, meeting Evan's eyes directly. You're very sick right now, she said with the kind of honesty that respected the child's intelligence. But sick doesn't mean dying. It means your body is fighting an infection, and we're going to give it the weapons to win that fight. It won't be fun, and you might feel worse before you feel better, but if you're brave and let us help you, you're going to be okay. Can you do that? Evan considered this with the seriousness of someone who'd learned too young that adults often lied about important things. What do I have to do? Take medicine that tastes bad. Let me listen to your lungs, even when you're tired. Rest even when you're bored. Can you be that brave? A long pause, then a small nod. I can try. That's all anyone can ask. Dr. Chen stood, already moving into treatment mode, pulling medications from her bags, explaining dosages and schedules to Lena with the rapid-fire efficiency of someone accustomed to working under pressure. Adrian watched the transformation of the elegant guest suite into a makeshift hospital room, watched expensive furniture get shoved aside to make room for medical equipment, watched his carefully controlled environment adapt to accommodate this unexpected invasion. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression suggesting barely controlled frustration. "Sir, Castellano's people are insisting on today's meeting. They're making threats about tell Castellano that if he wants to make threats, he can make them to my face. Otherwise, he can wait until I'm available." Adrian didn't look away from the scene unfolding in the guest suite. "Is that clear enough? Or do I need to call him myself?" Marcus's jaw worked, but he nodded. "Clear, sir." He left before his head of security could see something in his expression that might be interpreted as weakness. Adrian Wolfe had built an empire on the principle that emotion was liability, that caring created vulnerabilities enemies could exploit. Yet here he stood, prioritizing a sick child over partnerships that had taken years to cultivate, risking business relationships for reasons he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. The morning dissolved into a rhythm Adrian had never experienced in his own home. Dr. Chen moved through the guest suite with practiced efficiency, administering medications, setting up the nebulizer, explaining each step to Lena in medical terminology that gradually simplified when she saw the confusion in the mother's eyes. Evan endured the treatments with remarkable stoicism for a 7-year-old, only flinching when needles pierced skin, only crying quietly when the coughing fits became too violent to suppress. Adrian found himself returning to the suite repeatedly, drawn by something he couldn't name. He stood in the doorway watching Lena hold her son through nebulizer treatments, watching her stroke his hair when fever made him restless, watching her maintain that fierce protective presence, even as exhaustion carved shadows beneath her eyes. "You should rest," Dr. Chen told Lena around noon, after Evan had finally fallen into fitful sleep. "I'll monitor him. You've been awake for over 30 hours. I can't leave him." "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to sleep for a few hours. There's another bed in this suite. Use it." Lena shook her head with stubborn determination. "What if he wakes up and I'm not here? What if he needs me and I'm asleep?" "Then I'll wake you." Dr. Chen's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult patients and their families. "Lena, you're no good to him if you collapse from exhaustion. Rest. That's not a suggestion." Adrian watched the internal struggle play across Lena's face, the mother's instinct to maintain constant vigilance warring with the practical reality that she was running on empty. Finally, she nodded, moving to the second bed without even removing her shoes, lying down in a position that kept Evan visible, one hand reaching toward him as though maintaining physical connection even across the distance. She was asleep within minutes, her breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of someone whose body had been demanding rest for too long. Dr. Chen adjusted Evan's oxygen levels, checked his temperature again, then moved to where Adrian stood. Her expression carried professional assessment mixed with something more personal. "He's going to recover," she said quietly. "The pneumonia is serious, but we caught it before it became critical. With proper treatment and rest, he'll be fine." "How long?" "A week, maybe 2, before he's fully recovered. Then we'll need to address the underlying asthma management. Get him on a proper preventive regimen, ensure he has rescue inhalers accessible at all times, establish a relationship with a pulmonologist who can monitor his condition long term." Adrian processed this timeline, calculating implications. He can stay here during recovery. Dr. Chen studied him with open curiosity. "Mr. Wolfe, I've worked with you for 6 years. I've treated gunshot wounds at 3 in the morning without asking questions. I've provided medical care in situations that would make most doctors refuse to participate. But this?" She gestured toward the sleeping child and his exhausted mother. "This doesn't fit any pattern I've seen from you. Why are you doing this?" It was a question Adrian had been asking himself since he'd made the decision to follow Lena into that darkness. The logical answer, employee retention, improved performance, calculated advantage, felt insufficient. The emotional answer, shame, recognition, compassion, felt dangerous to acknowledge. "Does it matter?" he asked instead. "It matters if I'm going to continue providing care. I need to know this isn't some game, some manipulation that's going to hurt them worse when you lose interest." The accusation stung precisely because Adrian couldn't immediately dismiss it. How many times had he appeared generous only to leverage that generosity into obligation? How many calculated kindnesses had he deployed to secure loyalty or extract information? I followed her, Adrian said finally, his voice low enough that it wouldn't disturb the sleeping pair. Last night, I thought she was betraying me, stealing, meeting with rivals. Instead, I found her in a condemned building feeding her dying son my leftover meals and apologizing for not being able to afford medicine. He turned from the window where he'd been watching the gardens, meeting Dr. Chen's eyes directly. I've spent 15 years building walls against exactly this kind of involvement. I've made fortunes while others starved. I've lived in excess while people suffocated in poverty. I've justified it all as necessary, as the price of survival in a world that doesn't reward compassion. The words came faster now, as though something had broken loose inside him. But watching her apologize to that child for circumstances completely beyond her control, watching her work herself to exhaustion and still not have enough, watching her live in a building that should have been demolished while I have 42 rooms in this mansion, he stopped, struggling for words that could explain the shame without admitting to weakness. I can't unknow what I know. I can't return to comfortable ignorance. So yes, maybe this is self-serving. Maybe I'm doing this because I need to believe I'm not the kind of man who has resources to help and chooses not to. But it's not a game, and I'm not going to hurt them. Dr. Chen regarded him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. All right, I'll continue treatment, but understand something. That woman in there has built her entire life around protecting her son. She's learned not to trust help because help usually comes with strings. If you're going to do this, you need to do it completely. No half measures, no losing interest when the novelty wears off, no attaching conditions that compromise her dignity. Understood. I mean it, Adrian. I've seen too many people get their hopes raised only to have them destroyed. If you're not committed to seeing this through, I am. The conviction in his voice surprised even himself. Whatever Evan needs, whatever Lena needs, they'll have it. No conditions, no obligations beyond what she already owes as an employee. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. Then I'll stay for the next few days. Monitor his condition closely, adjust treatment as needed. After that, we'll need to establish longer-term care arrangements. She returned to her patient, leaving Adrian alone with thoughts that refused to organize into familiar patterns. Through the open door, he could see Lena sleeping with that same protective positioning, could hear Evan's breathing gradually improving as medications took effect, could witness the slow transformation of crisis into stability. Marcus appeared at his elbow with the silent approach that had made him valuable as security chief. Castellano agreed to reschedule. Next Tuesday. But he's not happy about it. Castellano's happiness isn't my concern. With respect, it should be. He controls 3 of our primary distribution channels. Antagonizing him creates complications we don't need. Adrian turned to face his head of security fully. Marcus, in the 15 years you've worked for me, have I ever made a decision that ultimately proved detrimental to our operations? No, sir. Then trust that I know what I'm doing now. Marcus's expression suggested he found this logic questionable, but he nodded. The East Suite. You want it maintained as medical space indefinitely? Until Evan is recovered and longer-term arrangements can be made. Longer-term arrangements, Marcus repeated the phrase carefully. Sir, are we talking about permanent housing for the Heart woman and her son? The question hung between them, forcing Adrian to articulate decisions he'd been making instinctively without fully examining their implications. Permanent housing meant permanent involvement, meant allowing these 2 people into his carefully controlled world in ways that violated every principle of isolation he'd maintained for 15 years. We're talking about ensuring adequate living conditions that don't exacerbate a serious medical condition, Adrian said finally. The specifics can be determined once Evan is stable. The staff is talking. They want to know if they should expect this kind of intervention for their own emergencies. What they should expect is competent performance of their duties without personal crises interfering with their work. Lena's situation came to my attention. I'm addressing it. That doesn't establish precedent for universal support. The words sounded harsh even to his own ears, the familiar rhetoric of calculated distance reasserting itself. Marcus nodded, satisfied with this framing, even if Adrian himself felt the inadequacy of the explanation. The afternoon brought unexpected complications. Evan's fever spiked despite medication, sending Dr. Chen into focused crisis management while Lena hovered at the bedside with barely contained panic. Adrian watched from the doorway as the doctor adjusted IV medications, monitored oxygen levels, made rapid calculations about whether hospitalization had become necessary. "Talk to him, doctor," Chen instructed Lena sharply. "Keep him calm. Anxiety makes the breathing worse." Lena leaned close to her son, stroking his fevered face with infinite gentleness. "It's okay, baby. You're going to be okay. Remember what Dr. Chen said? Your body is fighting, and we're giving it weapons. You just need to rest and let the medicine work." "It hurts, Mama." Evan's voice came thin and frightened. "My chest hurts." "I know, sweetheart. I know." Tears streamed down Lena's face, but she kept her voice steady. "But you're the bravest boy I know. Remember when you had to get those shots last year? You were so brave. You can be brave now, too." Adrian found himself moving closer despite knowing he had no useful role to play in this medical crisis. He stood near the bed, watching this child fight for breath, watching this mother maintain courage she clearly didn't feel, watching Dr. Chen work with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of emergency pediatrics. "Mr. Wolf." Evan's eyes found him through the fever haze. "Are you going to make my mama leave?" The question, so direct, so vulnerable, hit Adrian like physical impact. "No," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Your mother can stay as long as she wants. She has to work. She always has to work. Mrs. Chen watches me, but Mama has to work." "Not anymore. Not while you're sick." Evan's fevered gaze struggled to focus. "But then how will we eat? How will Mama pay for my medicine?" 7 years old and already carrying the weight of financial anxiety, already understanding that his illness created burdens his mother couldn't afford. Adrian felt that familiar shame intensify into something closer to rage, not at Lena, not at Evan, but at the systemic failures that force children to worry about medication costs instead of just being children. "You don't need to worry about that," Adrian said, leaning closer so Evan could see him clearly. "The medicine is handled, the food is handled, everything is handled. You just need to focus on getting better. You promise?" Such desperate hope in the question, such dangerous faith in adult promises that too often meant nothing. Adrian met Lena's eyes over her son's head, saw the warning there. Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't give him false hope. Don't add another disappointment to a life already too full of them. "I promise," Adrian said anyway, committing himself to something he didn't fully understand. "Everything you need, you'll have, no matter what it costs." The fever broke around sunset, Evan's temperature finally responding to the aggressive medication regimen. "Doctor." Chen sagged with visible relief, checking vitals one more time before nodding satisfaction. "Crisis averted," she announced, addressing Lena directly. "The pneumonia is responding to treatment. We're not out of the woods yet, but we've turned a corner." Lena made a sound somewhere between laugh and sob, pressing her face against Evan's hand. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet. He needs another week of intensive treatment, then months of careful management." "This isn't a cure, Lena. It's stabilization. The underlying asthma isn't going away." "I understand." Lena looked up, her face ravaged by exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "But he's going to be okay? Really okay? If we maintain proper treatment and remove him from that environmental nightmare you've been living in, yes, he should be fine." The environmental nightmare. The condemned building with no heat, no proper ventilation, mold in the walls and triggers everywhere. Adrian had seen it himself, had witnessed the physical manifestation of desperation that exacerbated every health problem Evan faced. "She can't go back there," Adrian said, the decision forming as he spoke it. "Neither of them can. Even after Evan recovers, that building will keep making him sick." Lena turned to him with new wariness. "Mr. Wolf, I appreciate everything you've done, but I can't accept—" "You can and you will." Adrian's voice carried the authority he used in negotiations that weren't actually negotiations at all. "The West Wing has staff apartments that aren't currently in use. You'll move into one of them, permanently. I can't afford— Consider it part of your compensation package. Housing, medical care, and continued employment. The only condition is that you maintain the same performance standards you've demonstrated for 8 months. He could see her struggling again, pride warring with practical necessity, the desperate desire to accept help fighting against years of learned self-reliance. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, echoing Dr. Chen's earlier question. "People don't just give away housing and medical care without expecting something in return." "I expect you to continue cleaning my house and preparing meals I barely eat," Adrian said. "Same job, better living conditions. That's the transaction." "That's not a transaction. That's charity." "Then call it enlightened self-interest. Your performance improves when you're not worried about your son dying in a condemned building. My life runs more smoothly when my staff isn't distracted by personal crises. Everyone benefits." The logic sounded hollow, even as he articulated it, the familiar justification of advantage failing to encompass the actual motivations driving these decisions. But Lena seemed to accept it, or at least accept that arguing further would be futile. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, we'll stay. Until Evan recovers at least. Then we can discuss longer-term arrangements." Adrian nodded, knowing that once Evan recovered, once they'd established patterns of stability, the discussion about long-term arrangements would become academic. He had no intention of sending them back to that building, had no intention of returning to the ignorance that had characterized the past 8 months. The mansion settled into new rhythms over the following days. Evan's condition steadily improved under Dr. Chen's careful management. Lena divided her time between nursing her son and attempting to maintain her regular duties, though Adrian had instructed the household staff to adjust expectations. The East Suite transformed from elegant guest quarters into functional medical space, filled with equipment and medications and the particular atmosphere of healing. Adrian found himself spending more time in that wing than he had in years. He told himself it was simple oversight, ensuring adequate care, maintaining awareness of how this unprecedented situation affected his household operations. But the truth manifested in smaller moments, bringing books he thought Evan might enjoy, ensuring Lena had meals delivered since she refused to leave her son's side for more than brief intervals, sitting in the corner of the suite working on his laptop, simply because his presence seemed to comfort the child during difficult treatments. "Tell me a story," Evan asked one evening, his breathing finally clear enough for extended conversation. He'd been awake for several hours, bored with the children's programs playing on the television Adrian had ordered installed. Lena looked up from the book she'd been reading, surprise crossing her features. "What kind of story, sweetheart?" "Not you, Mama. You always tell the same stories." Evan's eyes found Adrian, who'd been reviewing contracts in the suite's corner chair. "Mr. Wolf tells different stories, I can tell." Adrian set aside his laptop, genuinely uncertain how to respond. "I don't know children's stories." "Then tell me a grown-up story. Tell me how you got this big house." Lena tensed visibly, clearly concerned about what truths her employer might share with her 7-year-old son. Adrian considered the request, weighing honesty against age-appropriateness, settling somewhere in the middle. "I grew up in a place not very different from where you were living," he began, surprising himself with the decision to share this particular truth. "No heat, no proper food, just my mother and me trying to survive in a city that didn't care whether we lived or died." Evan listened with complete attention, his dark eyes focused despite lingering illness. "My mother worked 3 jobs, just like yours. She tried so hard to give me everything I needed. But sometimes trying isn't enough when the world is stacked against you. She got sick when I was 16. Pneumonia, actually. Like you have now." "Did she get better?" "No." The word came flat, emotionless, after years of distance. "She died because we couldn't afford the medicine. Because I was too young and stupid to understand how serious it was. Because the free clinic was overwhelmed and the hospitals wanted money we didn't have." Lena's hand moved to her mouth, her eyes reflecting understanding of how close they'd come to that same tragedy. "After she died, I decided I would never be powerless again. Never be in a position where I couldn't afford help, couldn't protect the people who mattered, couldn't control circumstances through sheer force of will and resources." "So you got this house?" "Eventually, through a lot of hard work and some choices your mother probably wouldn't want me explaining to a 7-year-old. Adrian managed something close to a smile. "The point is, I understand what it's like to watch someone you love struggle to breathe. I understand what it's like to feel helpless against circumstances you can't control. And I understand that sometimes people need help and there's no shame in accepting it. He looked at Lena directly. Your mother is the bravest person I've ever met. She works 3 jobs to keep you alive. She lives in terrible conditions so you can have medicine. She never complains, never asks for help, never expects anything from anyone. But everyone needs help sometimes, Evan, even the bravest people. The child considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. Are you helping us because your mama died? The question cut through Adrian's careful emotional distance with uncomfortable precision. Was he helping them because of his mother? Because watching Lena's dedication had reminded him of those final months when his own mother had worked herself literally to death trying to provide? Because some part of him that he'd thought dead still carried guilt for not saving her? Maybe, he admitted. Or maybe I'm helping because I can, and choosing not to would make me the kind of person I don't want to be. Evan nodded slowly, accepting this explanation with the faith children brought to adult reasoning they didn't fully understand. He yawned, medication and exhaustion finally overwhelming curiosity. Thank you for helping my mama, he said quietly, his eyes already drifting closed. She tries so hard. She deserves help. Adrian watched the child fall asleep, watched Lena tuck blankets around him with that same infinite gentleness, watched the scene that had become increasingly familiar over the past days. You didn't have to tell him that, Lena said softly, once Evan's breathing had evened into sleep. About your mother? He asked. He asks a lot of questions. You don't have to answer them all, honestly. Adrian set his laptop aside completely, giving her his full attention. Your son is 7 years old and worried about how you'll pay for his medicine. He deserves honest answers to his questions. Lena's eyes filled with tears that didn't quite fall. I never wanted him to worry about money. I tried so hard to shield him from those concerns. But he's too smart. He hears me on the phone with bill collectors. He sees me choosing between food and medicine. He knows we live in that building because it's all I can afford. You won't have to make those choices anymore. For now, while we're here, while Evan is recovering. But eventually you'll expect us to leave, and we'll be right back where we started. Adrian stood, moving to the window that overlooked dark gardens. What if I don't expect you to leave? Then I'd ask what you want in return. Because in my experience, nothing is free. Everything costs something, and I need to know what price you're expecting me to pay. He turned to face her, seeing the wariness in her expression, the learned suspicion of someone who'd been exploited too many times to trust apparent generosity. I want you to keep doing your job, he said simply. I want Evan to recover and thrive without environmental triggers making him sick. I want to not feel shame every time I walk through my 42 rooms, knowing you're struggling to keep your son alive. Those are my terms. You work, he recovers, and I sleep better at night. That's the transaction. That's not a transaction. That's salvation. Then call it whatever you need to call it, to accept help without feeling obligated. Lena wiped her eyes roughly, struggling for composure. I don't know how to do this. How to accept this much help without feeling like I'm losing something essential about who I am. Adrian recognized that struggle. He'd felt it himself years ago, when accepting help had required admitting to weaknesses he'd tried desperately to hide. You're not losing anything, he said quietly. You're gaining resources to do what you've been trying to do alone. Your dedication doesn't diminish because you have support. Your love doesn't mean less because you're not killing yourself to provide it. You're still the same fierce mother who lived in a condemned building feeding her son leftovers and apologizing for not performing miracles. You're just that mother with better tools. She smiled despite the tears, despite the exhaustion, despite everything. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone colder, more distant. The kind of man who lives in mansions and doesn't notice when his staff struggles. She glanced at her sleeping son. But you noticed, and you followed me, and you're helping for reasons I still don't fully understand. Maybe I'm helping because I'm tired of being the kind of man who doesn't notice, Adrian said, surprising himself with the admission. Maybe I'm helping because watching you sacrifice everything reminded me that I'd forgotten what that kind of dedication looks like. Or maybe I'm just selfish enough to want to believe I'm capable of compassion even after 15 years of building walls against it. Whatever the reason, Lena said softly, thank you for following me, for not firing me, for saving my son's life. Thank you. Adrian left before the gratitude could settle into something more complicated, before the vulnerability of the moment could force him to examine motivations he still didn't fully understand. He retreated to his office, where contracts and territory disputes waited with familiar simplicity, problems that could be solved through strategy and force, rather than whatever this new complexity required. But concentration proved elusive. He found himself staring at spreadsheets without processing numbers, reviewing contracts without retaining content, his mind drifting back to that guest suite where a child slept peacefully for the first time in months, and a mother finally rested without the crushing weight of impossible choices. Marcus appeared in the doorway near midnight, his expression carrying the particular tension that meant problems had emerged requiring Adrian's immediate attention. Castellano's people made contact. They're not happy about the postponement. They want assurances that our partnership remains solid. Then assure them. They want the assurances from you directly. They're questioning whether your attention has shifted, whether you're still committed to existing arrangements. Adrian set down the contract he'd been pretending to read. What exactly are they questioning? Your priorities. Marcus moved into the office, closing the door behind him. Word has spread that you're providing medical care and housing to a domestic employee, that you postponed a critical meeting to deal with a sick child, that you've been spending significant time in the East Wing instead of managing operations. Who told them that? Does it matter? The information is out there, and it's creating perception problems. People are wondering if Adrian Wolf is getting soft, if compassion is replacing calculation, if the empire is becoming vulnerable because its leader is distracted by domestic concerns. The analysis was tactically sound. In Adrian's world, perception shaped reality. Weakness invited challenge. Distraction suggested opportunity. He'd built his reputation on absolute focus, on ruthless prioritization of business over personal considerations, on demonstrating that nothing and no one could compromise his strategic clarity. Schedule a meeting with Castellano for tomorrow, Adrian said finally. Make it clear that my commitment to our partnership is unchanged, but also make it clear that questioning my judgment is inadvisable. And the perception problem? Will resolve itself once people see that helping one employee doesn't mean I've lost my edge in business negotiations. Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying his head of security carefully. Unless you're also questioning my judgment, Marcus. I'm questioning the wisdom of allowing personal involvement to create business complications. We've managed to build something extraordinary by maintaining clear boundaries between your private life and operational necessities. This situation threatens those boundaries. Noted. Is there anything else? Marcus's jaw tightened at the dismissal, but he shook his head. Just the Castellano meeting, 9 tomorrow morning. Fine. Now leave. I have work to finish. After Marcus departed, Adrian sat in darkness broken only by the city lights visible through his window. His head of security was right, of course. The situation with Lena and Evan did threaten boundaries he'd carefully maintained for 15 years. It did create vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. It did suggest priorities shifting in ways that could undermine the reputation that kept his empire secure. But walking away now felt impossible. Sending them back to that condemned building after Evan recovered, maintaining the careful distance that had characterized their relationship for 8 months, pretending he didn't know what he knew. None of those options felt viable anymore. Something had changed the night he'd followed Lena into darkness. Some wall had cracked that he didn't know how to rebuild, and whether that represented strength or weakness remained unclear. The meeting with Castellano the next morning proceeded with the aggressive posturing Adrian had anticipated. They met in neutral territory, a private room at an upscale restaurant where both parties could bring security without appearing overtly hostile. Castellano arrived with 2 enforcers, men who radiated barely contained violence. Adrian brought Marcus and maintained the calm superiority that had always characterized their negotiations. You've been difficult to reach, Castellano began, his accent carrying traces of his Sicilian origins despite 40 years in America. This concerns me. We have arrangements that require constant attention. Our arrangements continue undisturbed, Adrian replied. A single postponed meeting doesn't indicate wavering commitment. No, but it indicates changing priorities. I hear you've taken an interest in domestic concerns, a sick child, a struggling employee. Castellano's smile didn't reach his eyes. Admirable, perhaps, but potentially distracting from matters that should command your focus. Adrian sipped his coffee with deliberate calm. My focus remains exactly where it needs to be. The fact that I can manage both business operations and employee welfare simultaneously shouldn't concern you. It concerns me when my partners start developing compassion. Compassion creates weakness. Weakness invites challenge. Challenge threatens our mutual interests. Then let me be clear. Adrian set down his cup with precise control. My compassion, if that's what you want to call it, extends to exactly one employee who demonstrated exceptional dedication under impossible circumstances. It doesn't extend to business negotiations. It doesn't compromise my strategic clarity. And it certainly doesn't indicate the kind of weakness that invites challenge. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to the tone he used when subtle threats needed explicit reinforcement. If you're contemplating whether my helping a sick child means I've lost my edge in protecting my territories, I encourage you to test that theory. See what happens when you mistake basic human decency for strategic vulnerability. Castellano studied him for a long moment, evaluating whether this confidence represented genuine strength or desperate bluffing. Finally, he nodded slowly. I appreciate the clarification. Our partnership continues as established, without modification. Then we have no problem. Castellano stood, extending his hand with the formality their business relationship required. Though I would offer one piece of advice, Adrian, the world we operate in doesn't reward compassion. Be careful that your humanity doesn't become the weapon others use against you. Adrian shook the offered hand, maintaining the facade of cordial partnership while mentally cataloging the threat implicit in Castellano's warning. I'll keep that in mind. After the meeting concluded and they'd returned to the car, Marcus voiced the concern both men were thinking. He's going to test you. See if the compassion extends beyond one employee. See if it creates exploitable patterns. Let him test. He'll find my response educational. And if he targets the woman, the child, uses them as leverage? The suggestion triggered something cold and dangerous in Adrian's chest. A reminder that compassion did create vulnerabilities, that caring about anyone made them potential weapons in hostile hands. Then I'll demonstrate exactly how unwise that decision would be, Adrian said quietly. Make sure security around the mansion is reinforced. I want complete surveillance on the east wing. Anyone showing unusual interest in Lena or Evan gets flagged immediately. Marcus nodded, satisfied that Adrian understood the tactical implications, even if he didn't agree with the underlying choices. They drove back to the mansion in silence, both men processing the delicate balance between maintaining reputation and protecting new vulnerabilities. Adrian found Lena in the kitchen when he returned, preparing lunch with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized 8 months of service. She looked better than she had in days, more rested, less haunted by constant crisis, though worry still shadowed her features. "How is he today?" Adrian asked, accepting the coffee she offered without him requesting it. "Better. Dr. Chen says the pneumonia is clearing faster than she expected. He's breathing easier, coughing less." Lena's hands trembled slightly as she set down her own cup. "Mr. Wolf, I need to ask you something." "Ask." "The apartment you mentioned, in the West Wing. I'd like to see it. Start planning the move if the offer still stands." Adrian had almost forgotten making that offer amid the medical crisis and business complications. "Of course it still stands. Marcus can show you the available units this afternoon." "Thank you." She hesitated, clearly wrestling with something more. "I also need to give notice at my other jobs. The data entry work and the diner shifts. I can't maintain 3 jobs and properly care for Evan, especially if we're living here." The practicality of the statement masked the enormous trust it represented, giving up income streams that had sustained them through crisis, accepting dependence on Adrian's continued goodwill, betting everything on promises that people in her position had learned not to believe. "That's wise," Adrian said carefully. "Focus on Evan's recovery and your duties here. That's sufficient. The pay, if I'm only working 1 job, can I afford the apartment? Even with it being employee housing, there must be costs. The apartment comes with the position. No additional cost beyond what you're already paying for housing, which I assume is currently 0 given the condemned building's lack of legitimate rent." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. 0 plus the constant fear of structural collapse and exposure to environmental toxins. Very economical. Adrian found himself returning the smile despite the tension still coiling in his chest from the Castellano meeting. Then the West Wing apartment will be a significant upgrade at the same price point. Lena laughed. A real laugh, not the careful politeness she usually maintained around him. The sound transformed her features, reminding Adrian that she was still young, still capable of joy beneath the exhaustion and worry. "Can I ask you something else?" she said, the laughter fading back into seriousness. "You can ask. I may not answer. Why do you live alone in this enormous house? 42 rooms, you said. That's a lot of space for one person." The question surprised him with its personal nature, crossing boundaries Lena had carefully maintained throughout their relationship. "I value privacy, control over my environment, the ability to maintain security without worrying about other people's unpredictability." "That sounds lonely." "Lonely is safe. Lonely means no one can betray you, use your caring against you, exploit vulnerabilities that come from attachment." Lena studied him with unexpected directness. "Is that why you never married? Never had children? Because lonely is safer than risking attachment?" Adrian should have deflected, should have reminded her that his personal life wasn't appropriate conversation territory for an employee. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. "I watched my mother work herself to death trying to provide for me. I watched her sacrifice everything and still fail because the world doesn't reward dedication, it rewards resources. After she died, I decided I would never put myself in a position where caring about someone made me vulnerable to that kind of powerlessness again." "But you cared about her. That caring motivated you to build all this." Lena gestured at the mansion surrounding them. "Seems like attachment created strength, not weakness." Attachment created motivation. But it also created the worst pain I've ever experienced. Watching her die because I couldn't afford help, couldn't protect her, couldn't control circumstances through any amount of will or determination, that taught me that caring costs more than I'm willing to pay. Yet you're helping Evan, caring enough to provide resources, to reorganize your household, to risk business complications. Isn't that attachment? Adrian didn't have an adequate answer. She was right, of course. He'd violated his own principles by getting involved, by caring enough to act, by allowing Lena and Evan past walls he'd built specifically to prevent exactly this kind of vulnerability. "Maybe I'm making an exception," he said finally, "or maybe I'm just tired of being the kind of man who chooses safety over humanity." Lena's eyes reflected something Adrian couldn't quite identify. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition that they weren't as different as their circumstances suggested. "I think you're braver than you give yourself credit for. Compassion takes more courage than isolation." Before Adrian could respond, Evan's voice carried from the east wing. "Mama! Mr. Wolf, come look!" They found the boy sitting up in bed without assistance for the first time in days, his color better, his breathing unlabored, holding a drawing he'd completed with crayons Dr. Chen had provided to combat boredom. "Look what I made!" Evan's enthusiasm carried the particular energy of a child finally feeling well enough to engage with the world beyond survival. "It's our new house!" The drawing showed a building with too many windows and flowers that were larger than the stick figures standing in front of it. Two figures, clearly meant to be Lena and Evan, stood near the entrance. But beside them, Evan had drawn a third figure, taller and darker, labeled in careful letters. "Mr. Wolf." "That's you," Evan explained unnecessarily, beaming with pride at his creation. "You live in the house too, so I put you in the picture. We're all together now." Adrian stared at the drawing, at this child's interpretation of their situation, at the casual way Evan had incorporated him into their family portrait. The stick figure labeled Mr. Wolf stood slightly apart but still present, still part of the composition, still included in whatever this new configuration represented. "It's very good," Adrian managed, his voice rougher than intended. "You can keep it if you want. Mama hangs up all my drawings, but maybe you don't have any pictures in your office. It looks empty in there." The observation, delivered with childhood directness, hit harder than it should have. His office was empty. Deliberately so. No photographs, no personal mementos, nothing that suggested any life beyond the Empire's requirements. The sterility had always felt like strength, like freedom from sentimental attachment. Now it just felt lonely. "I would be honored to display your artwork," Adrian said formally, taking the offered drawing with more care than the crayons and construction paper warranted. Evan's smile could have powered the entire mansion. Really? You'll really put it up? Really? Lena watched this exchange with barely contained emotion. Her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall in front of her son. After Evan returned to his coloring with renewed enthusiasm, she followed Adrian into the hallway. "You don't have to hang it up," she said quietly. "He won't know if you don't actually display it in your office." "I said I would. I keep my promises." "He drew you into our family, into his conception of what home looks like now. That's a lot of pressure, a lot of expectation. You don't owe us that level of involvement." Adrian looked at the drawing again, at the three stick figures standing together in front of the too big house with its impossible flowers. "Maybe I don't owe it, but maybe I want to provide it anyway." The admission hung between them, acknowledging something neither had been willing to articulate before, that this arrangement had evolved beyond employer-employee, beyond charitable assistance, into something more complicated and far more dangerous to Adrian's carefully maintained isolation. "I don't want to trap you," Lena said. "Don't want Evan getting attached if you're going to pull away once the novelty wears off. He's already lost so much. I can't let him lose another person he's starting to care about." "Then don't let him lose me, and trust that I understand what I'm promising." The afternoon brought more complications. Adrian had just settled at his desk, Evan's drawing prominently displayed on the wall where he could see it from his chair, when Marcus appeared with information that transformed the Castellano situation from manageable to critical. "We have a problem. Castellano's people have been asking questions about Lena, her background, her schedule, where she goes when she's not working. They're building a profile." The cold danger Adrian had felt earlier intensified into calculated rage. "They're considering leverage. They're preparing options. Whether they deploy them depends on how they assess your response to pressure." Adrian stood, moving to the window where he could think without Marcus reading his expression. Castellano was testing exactly what Adrian had anticipated, whether compassion created exploitable weakness, whether caring about one employee meant vulnerability that could be weaponized. "Double security on the East Wing. I want eyes on Lena and Evan 24 hours a day. Anyone approaching them gets intercepted and questioned. Anyone showing sustained interest gets disappeared." Disappeared as in warned off, or disappeared as in permanent? "Start with warnings. Escalate as necessary." Adrian turned back to his security chief. "And send a message to Castellano. Tell him that while I appreciate his concern about my priorities, any action taken against my household staff will be interpreted as direct attack against me personally. Make sure he understands the consequences of that interpretation." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's a significant escalation. You're effectively declaring Lena and her son under your personal protection. That's not standard operating procedure for domestic employees. Then consider it a new policy. Anyone working in this household is under my protection. Anyone threatening them is threatening me. That's going to create complications. People will test those boundaries, see how far your protection extends, whether it applies to all staff or just specific individuals. Let them test. The response will clarify any ambiguity." After Marcus left to implement these new security protocols, Adrian returned to the window where city lights were beginning to appear as afternoon faded toward evening. He'd just made decisions that violated fundamental principles of his empire's operation, allowing personal attachment to drive strategic choices, extending protection beyond calculated advantage, creating vulnerabilities that enemies would certainly attempt to exploit. But watching Evan draw him into their family portrait, listening to Lena articulate fears about attachment and abandonment, understanding that they'd placed their survival in his hands with devastating trust, none of that allowed for strategic distance anymore. He'd crossed a line the night he'd followed Lena into darkness. Now he was committed to defending what existed on the other side of that line, regardless of the complications it created. "Doctor." Chen found him there an hour later, her expression carrying professional satisfaction mixed with personal concern. "Evan is recovering faster than I projected. Another week of observation, maybe less, and he'll be clear to resume normal activities with appropriate asthma management. You've saved his life, Adrian." "You saved his life. I just provided resources." "Resources he wouldn't have had without your intervention. Don't minimize what you've done here." She moved to stand beside him at the window. "But I need to warn you about something. That child is getting attached to you. He talks about Mr. Wolf constantly. What Mr. Wolf said, what Mr. Wolf promised, how Mr. Wolf is going to help them have a real home. I am helping them have a real home. I know. But kids his age don't understand nuance. They don't understand the difference between employer generosity and actual family. In his mind, you're becoming a father figure. Are you prepared for that responsibility? The question echoed Lena's earlier concern. Both women worried about the same vulnerability, that Evan would invest hope and attachment in someone who might eventually withdraw, creating new trauma on top of existing abandonment. I'm not withdrawing, Adrian said firmly. Whatever Evan needs from me, he'll have. Father figure, protector, provider, whatever role serves him best. That's a significant commitment. I'm aware, Doctor. Chen studied him carefully. You're not doing this just out of guilt about your mother, are you? Because trauma-driven choices rarely lead to healthy outcomes. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, because I have resources to help and choosing not to would make me someone I don't want to be. Because that child drew me into his family portrait, and I don't want to be the kind of man who disappoints 7-year-olds who've already experienced too much disappointment. All right. Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly. Then I'll continue monitoring his recovery and help establish long-term care protocols. But Adrian, understand something. You're not just providing medical care and housing anymore. You're becoming part of their lives in ways that will fundamentally change all of you. Make sure you're ready for that transformation. After she left, Adrian remained at the window as darkness completed its claim on the city. Transformation. The word carried weight he was still processing. His life had been carefully constructed to avoid exactly this kind of change. Predictable routines, controlled relationships, strategic distance from anything that might demand emotional investment. Now a 7-year-old boy had drawn him into a family portrait, and Adrian discovered he wanted to be the person that stick figure represented. Wanted to be someone a child could trust, could depend on, could incorporate into his conception of safety and home. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like something essential clicking into place, like finding a purpose beyond empire building that he hadn't known he was searching for. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus confirming that enhanced security was in place and that Castellano had received the warning. The business complications would continue. The territorial disputes would escalate. The careful balance of power would require constant vigilance. But for the first time in 15 years, Adrian Wolf had something more important to protect than his empire. He had a family, unconventional, unexpected, built from crisis and compassion rather than blood, but a family nonetheless. And he would defend it with everything he'd built, everything he'd become, everything he had. The stick figure in Evan's drawing stood slightly apart but still present, still included, still part of something larger than isolation. Adrian decided that was exactly who he wanted to be. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It unfolded gradually over the following weeks, reshaping the mansion's atmosphere in ways Adrian hadn't anticipated. Evan's laughter began echoing through hallways that had known only professional silence for years. Lena's presence expanded beyond service into something resembling actual residence, her nervous deference slowly giving way to cautious comfort. And Adrian himself discovered routines he'd never imagined, checking on Evan's progress before reviewing business reports, timing his evenings to coincide with the boys' bedtime stories, finding excuses to linger in spaces where this improvised family gathered. The West Wing apartment Lena and Evan moved into bore little resemblance to the condemned building's desperate emptiness. 2 bedrooms with actual furniture, a small kitchen stocked with food that didn't come from Adrian's leftovers, windows that sealed properly against October's advancing cold, heat that worked consistently, and most importantly, an environment free from the mold and triggers that had kept Evan perpetually sick. Adrian found himself involved in the move in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. He approved furniture selections, ensured Evan's room had proper lighting for the schoolwork he'd missed during illness, installed a bookshelf, and filled it with children's books he'd researched carefully. Marcus had watched this personal involvement with barely concealed bewilderment, clearly struggling to reconcile this behavior with 15 years of emotional distance. The boy needs educational materials, Adrian had said when his security chief questioned the expense of the book collection. Consider it an investment in future productivity. But they both knew the justification was hollow. Adrian wasn't investing in productivity. He was building a home for a child who'd never had one, trying to provide what his own mother had desperately wanted to give him, but couldn't afford. Evan's recovery progressed exactly as Dr. Chen had predicted. Within 2 weeks, his breathing normalized, his energy returned, and the constant fear of crisis receded into careful management. The boy threw himself into exploring his new environment with the enthusiasm of someone discovering that life could include joy instead of just survival. "Mr. Wolf, come see," became Evan's constant refrain, dragging Adrian away from contracts and territory disputes to admire drawings, inspect interesting rocks found in the garden, or share observations about birds visible from the apartment windows. Adrian went every time, abandoning whatever work had seemed urgent moments before, discovering that a 7-year-old's excitement about ordinary wonders felt more important than most of the crises demanding his attention. The household staff adapted to these changes with varying degrees of comfort. Some welcomed the warmth Lena and Evan brought to the mansion's sterile formality. Others worried that precedent was being established, that expectations were shifting in ways that might prove unsustainable. But all of them recognized that something fundamental had changed in Adrian Wolf's carefully controlled world. The business complications Adrian had anticipated materialized exactly on schedule. 3 weeks after the initial warning, Castellano made his move. Not overtly, not in ways that could be directly traced back to him, but through proxies and carefully constructed deniability. A man appeared outside the mansion's gates one afternoon, asking the guard about employment opportunities and showing unusual interest in household staff schedules. Marcus's enhanced security flagged him immediately, detained him for questioning, and discovered he'd been paid to gather information about the blonde woman and her kid. Adrian received this news while reviewing architectural plans for legitimate business expansion, the contrast between his dual realities never more apparent. He set aside blueprints that represented millions in legitimate investment to address threats emerging from his empire's darker foundations. "Bring him to the secure room," Adrian instructed Marcus. "I'll handle this personally." The secure room existed in the mansion's basement level, soundproofed and isolated, designed for conversations that couldn't risk external witness. The detained man, early 30s, nervous energy suggesting inexperience with serious consequences, sat handcuffed to a chair bolted to the concrete floor. Adrian entered alone, closing the heavy door with deliberate finality. He didn't speak immediately, just studied the man with the same analytical precision he brought to evaluating business partners or potential threats. "You're going to tell me who sent you," Adrian said finally, his voice carrying no particular emotion. "You're going to tell me what information you were paid to gather, and you're going to tell me what they plan to do with that information." "I don't know what you're talking about, man. I was just looking for work." Adrian moved faster than the man could track, his hand catching the back of the chair and tilting it until the prisoner hung at a precarious angle, muscles straining against gravity and restraints. "Let me clarify something," Adrian said, his voice still eerily calm. "I don't have patience for lies. And you don't have time to waste lying. The woman and child you were asking about are under my personal protection. Anyone threatening them is threatening me. Do you understand what that means?" Fear replaced bravado in the man's eyes. "Look, I was just doing a job. Some guy paid me $500 to ask questions, take some pictures if I could, report back about schedules and routines. That's all. I swear that's all." "What guy?" "I don't know his name. He found me at a bar, said it was simple surveillance work. Nothing dangerous. He didn't tell me who he was working for or why they wanted the information." Adrian released the chair, letting it drop back to stable positioning with jarring impact. "Describe him." The description matched one of Castellano's known associates, confirming what Adrian had already suspected. This wasn't random curiosity. This was reconnaissance, preparation for leverage or intimidation, testing whether Adrian's protection extended beyond verbal warnings. "You're going to deliver a message," Adrian said, leaning close enough that the prisoner had to meet his eyes. "You're going to tell whoever hired you that their surveillance was detected, that continuing this interest would be extremely unwise, and that Adrian Wolf protects what's his with absolute commitment. Can you remember that message?" Yes, I can remember." "Good. Because if I see you near this property again, if I discover you've shared any information about the people living here, if you've created any problems for the woman or her child, you won't get another warning. You'll simply disappear in ways that make finding you impossible and proving anything even more so. Am I being clear?" "Crystal clear. I swear I won't come back. I won't say anything except what you told me to say. Adrian had Marcus release the man at the city's edge with explicit instructions and implicit threats. Then he returned to his office where Evan's crayon drawing still hung prominently, a reminder of what he was defending and why the defense mattered more than any business relationship. But Castellano wasn't finished testing boundaries. 2 days later, Lena received a phone call on her personal cell, a number that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone outside her limited circle. The voice on the other end was professional, polite, and terrifying in its implications. Ms. Hart? This is regarding your son, Evan. We're calling from City General Hospital about outstanding medical bills. We need to discuss payment arrangements immediately. Lena's face went white as she listened, her hands trembling despite obvious efforts at control. Adrian, working in his office nearby, heard the distress in her voice through the open door and moved immediately to investigate. I don't understand, Lena was saying. Those bills were already on payment plans. I've been making regular installments. Those plans have been canceled. The full balance is now due immediately. $43,000, Ms. Hart. If you can't provide payment, we'll be forced to pursue collection through more aggressive channels. Adrian took the phone from Lena's shaking hands. Who is this? A pause. Then the voice continued with slightly less professional veneer. This is a private matter between the hospital and Ms. Hart. Who are you? I'm the person who's going to ensure you never contact this number again. The medical bills you're referencing have been resolved. If they haven't, provide documentation through legitimate hospital channels, not threatening phone calls to personal numbers that shouldn't be in your possession. Mr. Wolf, I presume. The voice dropped pretense entirely now. This is a courtesy call, a reminder that Ms. Hart has vulnerabilities that exist outside your protection. Financial obligations? Legal complications? The kind of problems that don't go away just because she's living in your mansion. This call is from Castellano. This call is from a collections agency representing legitimate creditors, though I'm authorized to convey that certain parties would be willing to forgive these debts in exchange for cooperation regarding your household security arrangements. The threat couldn't have been more explicit. Cooperate with surveillance, provide information about Adrian's private life, or face financial destruction through resurrected medical debt. Tell Castellano, and we both know who you're actually working for, that if he contacts Ms. Hart again through any channel, if he attempts to leverage her medical bills or any other aspect of her personal situation, I will interpret that as declaration of war. And I will respond accordingly. That sounds like a threat, Mr. Wolf. That's a promise. Now delete this number from whatever database you're working from, notify Castellano that his test has failed, and pray I don't decide to make examples of everyone involved in this attempted intimidation. Adrian ended the call and turned to find Lena collapsed in a chair, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I'm sorry, she managed between gasps. I'm so sorry. I didn't know they'd come after you through me. I didn't think about how helping us could create problems for you. Adrian knelt beside her chair, gently pulling her hands away from her face so she had to meet his eyes. Listen to me carefully. This isn't your fault. This is business complications that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with people testing whether I'm serious about protection. And I am serious, Lena, completely serious. But the medical bills, if they're really demanding full payment, they're not. That was intimidation, not legitimate collections. But even if the bills were real, even if they demanded payment tomorrow, I would handle it. You're not carrying that debt anymore. You're not carrying any of this alone. I can't let you pay $43,000. You can and you will, because that amount of money means nothing to me and everything to you. Because keeping you and Evan safe matters more than whatever complications Castellano thinks he can create. Because you're under my protection now, and that means something. Lena stared at him through tears, clearly struggling to process this level of commitment. Why are you doing this? Really? Not the justifications about employee performance or enlightened self-interest. Why are you risking your business relationships to protect us? Adrian had asked himself the same question repeatedly over the past weeks, searching for logical explanations that would fit comfortable patterns. But the truth defied logic, existed somewhere beyond calculation or strategic advantage. Because watching you sacrifice everything for your son reminded me of my mother, he said quietly. Because I have the power to prevent the tragedy that destroyed my childhood from destroying yours. Because for 15 years I've built walls against caring about anyone, And you and Evan somehow got past those walls without even trying. Because that drawing hanging in my office shows me as part of your family, and I want to be worthy of that inclusion." He stood, helping her to her feet with careful gentleness. "And because I'm tired of being the kind of man who chooses safety over connection. You asked if I was prepared for Evan to see me as a father figure. The answer is yes. I'm prepared to be whatever he needs me to be, whatever you both need me to be, regardless of the complications that creates." Lena wiped her face roughly, struggling for composure. "That's terrifying and wonderful, and I don't know how to handle it." "Then don't handle it. Just accept it. Let me protect you. Let me help Evan thrive. Let me be part of this family you've built from dedication and hope and absolute refusal to surrender despite impossible circumstances." She managed a watery smile. "You make it sound noble. Mostly it just felt like desperation and terror. Desperation and terror that kept your son alive when any rational person would have given up. That's not just noble, Lena. That's extraordinary." The confrontation with Castellano came 3 days later, not through intermediaries or proxies, but face-to-face in the same restaurant where they'd met previously. Adrian arrived alone despite Marcus's protests, making the statement explicit. This wasn't business negotiation. This was personal response to personal threat. Castellano sat at the same table, same enforcers flanking him, same calculated confidence in his expression. But something shifted when Adrian sat down, when Castellano saw whatever expression Adrian wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "You called this meeting," Castellano said. "I assume you have something to say." "I have a new policy to communicate," Adrian replied, his voice carrying the same calm he'd used in the secure room with the detained surveillance operative. "Anyone threatening my household staff in any capacity, through surveillance, intimidation, financial leverage, or any other method, will be treated as though they've threatened me directly, and my response to direct threats is comprehensive and permanent. That's a significant policy shift. You're extending personal protection to domestic employees. I'm extending personal protection to people under my roof. The distinction doesn't matter. The consequences do." Castellano leaned back, studying Adrian with new calculation. "You're willing to risk our partnership over a maid and her sick child?" "I'm willing to end our partnership if you continue testing boundaries that aren't negotiable. The distribution channels you control are valuable but not irreplaceable. Your continued existence in this city, however, depends entirely on whether you choose to respect this new policy." The threat hung explicit and undeniable. Castellano's enforcers tensed, hands moving toward weapons concealed under expensive suits. But Castellano himself remained still, evaluating whether Adrian was bluffing or whether compassion had genuinely transformed into something more dangerous than the calculated ruthlessness he'd navigated for years. "You've changed," Castellano said finally. "The Adrian Wolf I've known for a decade wouldn't make these threats over domestic staff. Then consider this your introduction to the Adrian Wolf who exists now, the one who discovered that isolation isn't strength, it's just lonely. The one who learned that having something worth protecting creates motivation that pure self-interest never could. The one who will burn down everything he's built before allowing harm to come to the people he's claimed as family." "Family," Castellano repeated the word with something like wonder. "You've adopted them? Legally?" "Family doesn't require legal documentation. It requires commitment and protection, both of which I'm providing absolutely." Castellano nodded slowly, his expression shifting from calculation to something approaching respect. "Then I withdraw my interest. The woman and child are untouchable. Our business relationship continues as established, with this new parameter acknowledged. And the medical bills? The threatening phone call? Will be resolved. The debt's forgiven, the collectors redirected. Consider it a gesture of goodwill toward your new family." Adrian stood. The meeting concluded. "Don't test me again, Castellano. The next boundary violation won't get a warning." He left before Castellano could respond, walking out into afternoon sunlight, with the particular relief that came from successfully navigating confrontation without violence, while making threats credible enough to prevent future challenges. Marcus met him at the car, his expression suggesting grudging approval despite continued concerns about strategic implications. "That could have gone badly," the security chief observed. "But it didn't. Castellano understands now that my protection isn't performative. He won't test it again. And if others test it, If word spreads that Adrian Wolfe has vulnerable attachments that create leverage opportunities, then they'll learn the same lesson Castellano just learned, that threatening what I protect guarantees destruction, not advantage. The mansion had transformed completely by the time winter arrived. What had been sterile formality became something warmer, more alive, more genuinely resembling a home than the fortress Adrian had built for isolation. Evan's presence infused spaces with energy they'd never known. His drawings covering refrigerator doors, his books scattered across surfaces, his laughter interrupting business calls and contract reviews. Lena had grown into her role not just as employee but as resident, her nervous deference replaced by comfortable confidence. She still maintained her cleaning duties, but the relationship had evolved beyond simple service into something more complex and infinitely more valuable. Dr. Chen's final evaluation came on a cold December morning, exactly 2 months after Evan's initial crisis. She examined the boy thoroughly, reviewed his progress charts, consulted with the pulmonologist Adrian had arranged for ongoing care, and finally delivered her assessment with professional satisfaction. He's recovered completely. The pneumonia is gone, the asthma is well controlled with proper medication, and his lung function is excellent. With continued management and avoiding environmental triggers, he should live a completely normal, healthy life. Evan, sitting on the examination table in the mansion's converted medical room, beamed with pride at this pronouncement. Does that mean I can go to school now? Real school? Not just the tutoring? That means you can do whatever normal 8-year-olds do, Dr. Chen confirmed, including school, assuming your mother and Mr. Wolfe approve the arrangements. The casual way she included Adrian in parental decisions reflected how thoroughly the household had accepted this new configuration. Adrian wasn't just the employer anymore, wasn't just the benefactor providing resources. He'd become part of the family structure in ways that would have terrified him months ago, but now felt surprisingly natural. We'll arrange enrollment after the holidays, Adrian said, already mentally cataloging the best private schools, the security arrangements necessary to keep Evan safe, the logistics of integrating a child's schedule into the household's routines. After Dr. Chen departed, and Evan ran off to share the good news with the kitchen staff who'd adopted him as collective mascot. Lena lingered in the medical room with Adrian. I keep waiting for the catch, she said quietly. For the moment when you tell us this was temporary, when the bill comes due, when we discover what all this generosity actually costs. There's no catch, Lena. No hidden bill. No cost beyond what I've already stated. People don't do this. They don't take in struggling employees and their sick children and transform their entire lives without expecting something in return. Adrian moved to the window, looking out at gardens where Evan often played now, visible security ensuring his safety without restricting his freedom. Maybe people don't, but I'm doing it anyway, because it's right, because I can, because you and Evan have become the family I didn't know I needed until you arrived. We're not your redemption project. No, you're not. You're people I care about who needed help. The fact that helping you also helped me doesn't diminish the value of what you bring to my life. Lena joined him at the window, watching her son chase autumn leaves with the energy of someone who'd forgotten what constant illness felt like. He asked me last night if you were going to be his father now, if that's what this situation means. The statement should have triggered Adrian's carefully constructed defenses against attachment and obligation. Instead, it created warmth in his chest, a sense of rightness he had never experienced regarding family connections. What did you tell him? I told him that families come in different forms, that sometimes the people we choose become more important than the people we're born to, that you've been more of a father to him in 2 months than his biological father ever was in 7 years. And how do you feel about that? Lena turned to face him directly. Terrified, grateful, confused about what this means for us, for you, for whatever this unconventional arrangement is becoming. But mostly, I feel safe for the first time since Evan was born. Safe knowing that if something happens to me, he'll have someone who cares about him, who'll protect him, who'll ensure he has the life he deserves. Nothing's going to happen to you. You can't promise that. Life is unpredictable and dangerous and full of circumstances we can't control. But knowing you're here, knowing you've committed to protecting him, that matters more than you probably understand. Adrian took her hand, the gesture feeling simultaneously natural and momentous. Then let me make something clear. This isn't temporary. This isn't charity that ends when the crisis passes. You and Evan are part of my life now, part of this household, part of whatever family structure we've built together, permanently. Tears filled Lena's eyes, but she smiled through them. You're going to make a terrible father if you keep making promises you might not be able to keep. Then I'll just have to keep them all. Seems simpler than dealing with disappointment from an 8-year-old who draws me into family portraits. The holidays brought unexpected joy to the mansion. Adrian had never celebrated with particular enthusiasm, treating Christmas as obligation rather than opportunity. But Evan's excitement proved infectious, his wonder at decorations and traditions transforming the season into something genuinely meaningful. They decorated together, Adrian, Lena, and Evan, transforming the mansion's formal spaces into something festive and warm. Evan insisted on a massive tree in the main foyer, wanted lights strung along the gardens, demanded cookies be made and carols be played, and all the traditional elements he'd never experienced in the condemned building's desperate poverty. Adrian provided everything without hesitation, discovering that watching a child experience joy felt better than any business success he'd achieved in 15 years. On Christmas morning, Evan tore through presents with enthusiastic chaos, while Lena watched with tears streaming down her face, and Adrian documented everything on a camera he'd purchased specifically for capturing these moments. The boy had asked for books and art supplies, his requests modest despite unlimited resources. Adrian had provided those and more. A telescope for the astronomy interest Evan had developed watching stars from his new bedroom window, a bicycle for the spring weather, educational games and puzzles, and everything a curious child might need to thrive. But Evan's favorite gift wasn't purchased. It was the adoption papers Adrian had arranged quietly, worked through legal channels carefully, ensured every detail protected Lena's parental rights while establishing Adrian's permanent commitment. What does this mean? Evan asked, studying the official documentation with typical seriousness. It means Mr. Wolf is legally your father now, Lena explained, her voice thick with emotion. It means you're his son, officially and permanently. It means our family is real, not just something we created through circumstances. Evan looked up at Adrian with those dark eyes that had first captured his attention in that condemned building, that had reflected fever and fear, and finally, hope. You're really my dad now? Forever? Forever, Adrian confirmed, kneeling so they were eye level. If that's what you want. I want it. Evan launched himself forward, wrapping small arms around Adrian's neck with fierce certainty. I want you to be my dad. I want us to be a real family. Adrian held the boy close, feeling walls he'd maintained for decades finally crumbling completely, discovering that vulnerability wasn't weakness after all. It was the foundation of everything that actually mattered. Over Evan's shoulder, he met Lena's eyes and saw his own transformation reflected there. She'd stopped being just the maid months ago, had evolved into something far more essential, partner, co-parent, the person who'd accidentally broken through his isolation and reminded him what genuine connection felt like. Thank you, she mouthed silently, her gratitude encompassing everything, the medical care, the housing, the protection, the love that had developed unexpectedly but completely. Adrian nodded, understanding they'd saved each other. She'd reminded him that wealth meant nothing without purpose, that power was hollow without something worth protecting, that the fortress he'd built for safety had actually been a prison of loneliness. And he'd given her and Evan the security and resources to transform survival into actual living, to replace desperation with stability, to build the life she'd worked 3 jobs trying to provide. The mansion on Cresthaven Hill didn't sleep anymore. It breathed with life. A child's laughter, a mother's songs, a man's gradual discovery that family could be chosen rather than inherited, that love could develop from compassion rather than blood, that the empire he'd built for isolation could be transformed into something that actually felt like home. Adrian Wolf had followed his maid into darkness, expecting betrayal. Instead, he'd found the truth that changed everything, that the one thing more dangerous than caring was refusing to care. That power without purpose was just accumulation, that the fortress he'd built to protect himself had actually prevented him from living. Now, watching Evan play with his new telescope while Lana prepared dinner and the household staff moved through routines that accommodated this new family's rhythms, Adrian understood what he'd been missing for 15 years. Not safety, not control, not the isolation that prevented betrayal, just this. The warmth of belonging, the purpose of protection, the simple extraordinary reality of being needed and choosing to meet that need completely. He'd spent a decade and a half building walls against exactly this vulnerability. Now those walls had fallen, and instead of the destruction he'd always feared, Adrian discovered something far more valuable on the other side. He discovered home. He discovered family. He discovered that compassion wasn't weakness after all. It was the only strength that actually mattered, the only power worth protecting, the only empire worth building. And that discovery changed everything, forever.